Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining the transport session of the ETP conference. And I'm delighted to be your chair this morning and for the early part of this afternoon as well. My name is Alex Reid, and I'm the Business Development Manager for Zero Emission Mobility at ETP. So I've got the great privilege today of chairing this session where you're going to hear from 5 speakers, 4 of which representing the academic community, and the first of which is coming from industry, coming from a business called HV Systems, who are based in Glasgow or just outside Glasgow, and will provide some insights into the steps they're taking to really accelerate not just Scotland, but the international transition to zero emission mobility. It's a very exciting business, very exciting projects they're working on. And I won't reveal too much because our presenter, Daniel, is going to share more about that. But just before we get into each of the presentations, just a little bit of a housekeeping for everyone. The presentations themselves will last about 15 minutes each. That's to ensure that we wrap up before or just at 1 p.m. You have the opportunity to ask questions of any of our presenters, so just use the chat to do that. I'll be keeping an eye on the questions as they come in, and time permitting, I'll ask a question or questions of the presenters once they've finished their presentation. Other thing to highlight is that there will be a prize at the end of the conference for the best presentation. It's nothing too serious, just a little bit of fun, but they'll be kind of judging, and I'll be judging presentations based on the quality of them, content of them, and obviously the contribution the research is making towards decarbonisation of our energy systems. And I think with that, I will just briefly introduce all of our speakers before we get to the first one, and the order in their speaking in as well. So first of all, as I've touched on, we're going to have Daniel Masenga Grant from HV Systems. Then it's going to be followed by Katie Davis from University of Strathclyde. And then we're going to have presentation from Jorge, who's from University of Aberdeen, and then from Jenny Milne, who's also researching at the University of Aberdeen, and then finally John Lowe from University of Edinburgh. Okay, so to kick things off, I'd like to hand over now to Daniel from HV Systems, and who's going to talk us through who they are, what they're doing, how they're doing it, and ultimately what the benefits are going to be from a transport decarbonisation standpoint. So over to you, Daniel. And just to say to everyone, I'm sharing the slides on Daniel's behalf, so Daniel will be nudging me as he goes through just to transition through the slides. So over to you, Daniel.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for having me on. So at HVS, we are really focused on decarbonising the heavy-duty transport sector, and that's through the production of our vehicles, which are hydrogen electric vehicles, and we're doing a HGV truck and an MCV, which is a large van. Next slide. So today's presentation, I'll take you through the company. I'll take you through a bit of our team, and I'll also talk a bit about a strategic investment that we received this year, just in July, which we were really excited about, and there's a number of reasons for that. And I'll give you a little bit of a closer look at the products we're producing as well. Go to the next slide, Alex. Next one from this. So this is the team that we've built up. Our CEO is Jawad Khurshid, took over the company in 2020. And since then, we've been really focused on just pushing through our 2 vehicles. If you go back to the team slide. The other members of our team, we've got a few who are really experienced from the... Steve Clayton is our CTO, who's worked for Alexander Dennis, Bentley, Lagonda. And we've also got Pete Clark, our COO, who's responsible for the vehicle designs that you can see. And he's also got over 15 years experience in the automotive sector and vehicle design. Recently, we've been looking more and more towards manufacture. And that's why we brought in Keith Stanton. And we didn't think we could find someone with and Steve, who's got 35 years, but Keith came in 37 years experience in the automotive sector, and has built a number of manufacturing facilities across Europe. So we're very excited to have him on board and working towards manufacture. Abdul Wahid's our Chief Innovation Officer, but he's also one of the founders. So his role is to make sure that all of the IP, the intellectual property that's coming out of our vehicles is being protected, and that we're able to utilize that in the market. Dr. David Telford, he's especially in this part of the world around Glasgow, he's a recognized energy systems expert, but he's previously worked mostly in the built environment. But now that we're moving into electric vehicles, he's able to bring that experience in systems modeling, and so he's able to do a lot of the simulations around calculating range of our vehicle, but also cost of ownership, and he's a great asset to our team. The other members of the team, we have expertise in obviously finance, and we've got people who have previously worked in the logistics sector. We've got myself, an environmental background, so I look at everything we do as a company and make sure that it benefits the environment, that we're keeping to our key mission of producing zero-emission vehicles that decarbonize the transport sector. And then around this core team, we've got a kind of a cloud of advisors that we can pull on their expertise when needed, such as Dr. Charles Stone, who has a lot of experience with fuel cells, and Mark Arthur, who's got a lot of experience in the built environment, project managing construction, so we can pull on him for any infrastructure side. The investment that I talked about that we were so excited about came in from Eurogarges Group. It was a multi-million-pound investment, and the reason that we were so excited was not just because it gave us the funds that we required to build our demonstrator vehicles, but they're also a really strategic investor. So within Eurogarages, they own over 6,000 refueling stations across the world, 1,500 in the UK. And so we're going to be working with them on one of the barriers to bringing hydrogen vehicles to the market is where's the refueling infrastructure. So to have an investor in our company with such such a large network in refueling is a great boon for our company. They also recently bought over Asda, which has a fleet of 4,000 HGVs and 2,000 vans. So this removed the chicken and egg situation of the infrastructure suppliers saying, well, we'll put the infrastructure out once there's vehicles on the road, and the vehicle manufacturers saying we can put some vehicles out once there's refueling network. Now, within the same umbrella, we have thousands of refueling stations that can be converted. We have a fleet of thousands of vehicles that will require changing. We've got obviously ourselves who are making zero-emission commercial vehicles. And they're also, within their umbrella, they've got another company called LeasePlan, who already lease out commercial vehicles to other companies. So this has all been brought within the same umbrella, and it's a clear and direct route to market for us, which is why we're so excited about this strategic investor. So go to the next slide, please. There's a bit of delay on my slides, so I'll just...
Yeah, hey Daniel, is it coming up yet?
In the presentation on my own one, because I think my in time, isn't it? So I can look at and keep talking while you cheat.
Okay.
Takes away my...
So yeah, I've got the slide. I've got the Hey, it'll be cool. So yeah, I've got the why. I think everyone else should be able to see the why hydrogen slide. So if you just want to use your own slides, just to
great. Yeah, of course.
Talk through that.
Yeah. Today, there's three parts that the logistics industry looks at vehicles. want to be able to carry a heavy load, refuel quickly. They want to be able to have a range for the vehicles. And we know battery electric vehicles will make leaps and bounds into the private sector. In large vehicles, technology is really struggling to be able to give all of the long range, the big payloads and the quick refueling. But with hydrogen, you have these three things, and you also are able to aspect. So that's why the concept that we're bringing this technology into the heavier sector. Follow set routes, having to have around every corner private vehicles. You're able to implement a strategic network stations. We like to call us back to base refueling. So if you have a refueling station at your house and one at your depot, then you're able to cover the majority of your HGV movement between those two. And we actually carried out a heat map analysis and checking where the HGVs go. And obviously it was the major motorway networks, you know, 6, the M74 and the M8. And we figured out that if you put in hydrogen stations of a significant size, but if you strategically implemented them, you'd only need 7 to cover the majority of the UK fleet needs between Dover and Aberdeen. So it shows you how quickly we can transfer in the commercial sector towards hydrogen, whereas it will take a lot longer in the private sector. Next slide. So HV systems, we're looking to the future. 5-year plan. Year 1 is 2022. So we're around 4 months next year from having our first demonstrator vehicle up and running. That'll be the van. And we're within a year, so kind of October next year, we'll also have the working demonstration vehicle for the HGV, which you can see on this slide. Following that, we're hoping to bring the HGV to market first because that's where the biggest demand is from our customers, but it's also the largest potential for emissions reduction. 4x2 articulate HGV is the most polluting vehicle in Europe, and you can get the most emissions reduction for converting the least amount of vehicles. We go for that first. And then following on from that, we'll bring the van to market as well and continue to diversify what we can offer to customers. Next slide. This gives you a bit of a closer look at our vehicles. We've obviously got the HGV, which is an N3 European vehicle category. And we expect this to be quite a fixed offering. This is going to be high volume manufacture and giving our customers a logistics vehicle. It's what they're looking for. But with the MCV van, we're expecting there to be a lot larger diversification of what we're offering. So looking into ambulance and fire rescue services, niche and specialist applications such as equestrian and of course logistics delivery vans. And we already are working with funded grant and the Scottish Ambulance Service to look into the design for a hydrogen-powered ambulance based on our MCV van platform. Go to the next slide. This is a bit of a look into the technology of our hydrogen vehicles. So it's a fuel cell technology. It's hydrogen stored on board in compressed canisters. Hydrogen goes into the fuel cell, converts to electricity and water. The water is the byproduct. The electricity either goes straight to the motors to power them, or it can go and be stored in batteries. The batteries on board can also be used for regenerative braking to increase the efficiency of the vehicle. We're trying to, you can see there's quite a lot of design overlap between the two vehicles. This is deliberate. We're going for a little brother, big brother approach to make sure that there's as much supply chain overlap as possible to increase efficiency there. But also for manufacturing efficiency to make sure we can even make a flexible manufacturing facility and create both of these in the same place. Next slide. So this is me coming to the end of the presentation, and it's where we are at the moment of HV Systems. We're almost completed with our demonstrator vehicle build, and we're already looking towards manufacturing. We're talking to the Scottish Government, and we've been approached by a couple of governments as well about potential sites that we could use. We're doing a lot of planning around this at the moment, but we're very focused on pushing our vehicles forward and making sure we can bring hydrogen zero-emission commercial vehicles to the transport market as soon as we can and start to get the transport emissions down. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for that. And as always, the joys of doing these live presentations is they don't always run 100% smoothly, but I hope for everyone that you found that very illuminating. And indeed, it's a great example of how research is translating into real practical applications in the marketplace. And I think the nature of what HV systems are doing, and particularly through the lens of Scotland, is really significant and important. So I'm just transitioning out of presentation mode at the moment. Hopefully, if just bear with me. Can you still see the slides, guys, at the moment, or am I out of sharing? Right, okay. So I think I'm just going to check if there's any questions for Daniel. I don't think so. We do have a few minutes, so I think what I'll do is just fire kind of quick question at Daniel. Just so based on what you're highlighting, you've made great strides, particularly in the last 18 months in terms of securing investment, in terms of building out a clear product roadmap. From a research and development standpoint, I mean, what do you see as being the kind of key challenges that you're going to be facing over the next 2 to 3 years? And do you feel that there's a role for academia, either inside or outside Scotland, to support HVS in terms of addressing some of those research challenges?
Yeah, so as HV Systems, we're a systems integrator. So what we do is we bring the best components we can find together and integrate them into our vehicle designs. So for us, the R&D is all about how we make those work together in the best way, and making sure these components are controlled by a very efficient control system that makes them work together in the best way. So that's where a lot of our IP is going to arise from. It's where we've got team members working on this at the moment. Also around the packaging, so that's the kind of the software side of how these components are going to work together. There's also the packaging side. How do we fit them all onto these trucks that have to carry heavy loads we don't want to eat into the payload? So we've got a weight limit, and we also we want to fit as much hydrogen on board as we can, so you can increase the range. So those are the two kind of main R&D challenges that we're facing. We are at University of Strathclyde. We've sent them a list of kind of R&D demands to see what they can come back with. So things obviously around the control system, around cooling of the powertrain components, looking into the future. We're very proud to be a Scottish company, and we would love if we could get more of our components to be supplied from Scotland. One, to reduce the transport emissions of getting these components to us, but also to kind of bring that supply chain within the UK and build up the zero emission automotive sector in the UK again. So anyone that's producing a new fuel cell, that'd be fantastic. We've found someone last week who's producing hydrogen storage canisters in Scotland, so we're starting to talk to them. So any kind of components around the powertrain would be fantastic. But at the moment, as I say, we're a systems integrator. Our main goal is to get these vehicles to market as quick as possible. So we want components that are working at the moment, but we're always looking to R&D, and we're always looking to the future. And how can we we know the technology is going to increase over the next 10 years as the hydrogen economy expands. So we're leaving space for that in our vehicles, and both software-wise and physical-wise, for the technology that's coming. So we're excited to see what people can bring.
Okay, well, thank you, Daniel, for that. Just conscious of time, there are one or two more questions coming in that we might pick up towards the end if we've got time. But I think in your wrapping up, you've set the scene very clearly in the context of what further research support is going to be needed. and really setting the challenge also for the universities and the researchers across Scotland to participate in that research, because having or shortening supply chains and having a business like HVS that's based in Scotland, is a real incentive to do the research that can achieve those outcomes. So again, thank you very much for your presentation. We're now going to move into the first of the 4 academic research presentations, and they're really going to showcase some of the best research that's happening around transport, around how transport can be decarbonised. So our first presenter is Katie Davis from the University of Strathclyde, and Katie's going to tell us a little bit about the research she's doing around how GIS, graphical information systems, can be used to widen the uptake of EV, electric vehicles. So Katie, if you could share your screen and start to take us through your presentation, thanks.
Thank you, Alex. I think that should be my screen shared now, if you can see it. I'll assume so fab. So yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Katie. I'm in my first year of my PhD in electrical engineering at the university. My PhD is about energy infrastructure regarding electric vehicles, EVs. But as Alex said, today I'll be talking about how Geographic Information Systems, GIS, can enable widening access to EVs, electric vehicles. So I'll start off by giving just a quick bit of background to the project. Then I'll talk through what the barriers to EV ownership actually are. We'll look at how GIS could be used to address these, and then I'll wrap up with a wee conclusion at the end. So the Scottish Government have set a series of legally binding targets to reduce Scotland's emissions, the first of which comes into force in 2030, where they want to reduce Scotland's emissions by 75% compared to 1990 levels. And that's with a view to achieving net zero by 2045. Transport is Scotland's biggest culprit behind emissions, so it follows that decarbonisation of transport would be a key pillar to the achievement of net zero. This is reflected by the ban of the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2030, so it seems likely that we'll see a reasonable increase in ownership of EVs. However, there are barriers to EV ownership, and it's really important that we address these so that we can all move towards net zero together. So what actually are the barriers? The first one to mention is costs. EVs are generally quite expensive, and also the recent upwards trend in EV ownership has yet to have an impact on the used car market. Often a second-hand vehicle can be an affordable alternative for people who find a new vehicle to be out with their budget. And because the second-hand EV market is still very much in its infancy, that does also pose a bit of a barrier. There's also a cost associated with installing a charging point for your EV. Usually at your home you would do that. So there is actually quite a high upfront cost related to making that switch from a petrol car to an EV. Following on from that, the second barrier is access to residential off-street parking, which is really important for installing your home charging point. If you don't have access to a driveway or some other kind of form of off-street parking, for example, if you maybe live in a tenement or other high-density housing, you will probably find that as a barrier to owning an EV. And following on from that, the next barrier I have listed here is the possession of a regular workplace. So the two most common places to charge your car are at home or at work. So if you don't have a regular workplace that you're going to every week, that means you probably don't have a charging opportunity here either. So that will also be a barrier. And then following on from that, the last point I have here is the availability of a public charging network. So if you can't charge at home and you can't charge at work, then you have to be able to charge publicly. And the publicly available charging infrastructure at the moment is likely to be insufficient to support a large increase in EV ownership. So that really has to be developed to try and tackle some of these barriers. So can we use GIS to address the barriers? We know that GIS can be really useful in lots of different applications, such as monitoring of deforestation or coastal erosion, and it can actually be used in civic planning too. So could we use it to identify the barriers and try and widen access to EVs. So just to begin with, what actually is GIS for those that are perhaps unfamiliar? As I said earlier, it stands for Geographic Information System, and it's most commonly used for conducting spatial analysis, and it's also good for making nice pretty maps basically as well, which is a really nice visually impactful way of representing data across a region. You can conduct analysis in GIS using broad zones, so maybe like a national level or a local authority level, or you can also look at finer resolution zones, more localized zones, such as perhaps even a street-to-street basis. You can look at people data in GIS, so you can map things like deprivation or income, and you can also map more physical data, so perhaps things like the electricity network or maybe mean temperature across a region. Previous work has been done, and they modelled societal characteristics and travel patterns of those who are likely to make that switch between a petrol or diesel car to an EV. And that was done to try and identify where key charging hotspots could be in cities. But what I'm trying to do in this project is see if we could use GIS to identify where barriers to EV ownership are, and then use that as a way of prioritising the distribution of resources effectively to break down these barriers. So I started off with some broad zone analysis, and I'm looking here at Scotland at a local authority level. And on the left-hand side, I've mapped the publicly available charging devices per 100,000 people. And on the right-hand side, we have the average weekly household income. So how is this useful? Well, if we begin by looking at Glasgow City, on the left-hand side here, it's highlighted there for you, we can see that it has a really low number of charging devices per 100,000 people. And then if we look to the right, at Glasgow City again, we can see it also has a really low average income. So that suggests that people in Glasgow City will face barriers to EV ownership. And that means this area should be a priority when we look at dishing out our resources. If we then go to look at Aberdeenshire and look at the left-hand side, we can see that it also has a relatively low number of charging devices per 100,000 people. But when we look to the right, we can see it actually has quite a high average income. So yes, this still means that the charging infrastructure needs developed in Aberdeenshire, but perhaps it would be less of a priority region than Glasgow City, as that high average income shown on the right suggests to us that the people in Aberdeenshire perhaps are facing fewer barriers than those in Glasgow City. However, important to note with this analysis is that because we're looking at those broad zones, we're looking at data which is averaged over quite large areas. I think we can all kind of know from experience that something, especially like income, can vary from street to street, never mind across a whole local authority area. So therefore, that broad zone analysis is probably best if we want to get the rough picture, the rough idea of what's going on. But finer resolution analysis would potentially be more valuable if we're looking at more detailed work, such as planning of the charging infrastructure. So next I went on to try and do some finer resolution analysis. And you can see just by looking at the full extent of Scotland here, just how much finer this analysis is compared to the previous maps, because we actually just can't really see a lot of what's going on there because the zones are so small. And that's why I've zoomed in on Dundee City this time, and it's in the bubble on the right-hand side there, so you can see what's happening. So what this is the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. It's quite a holistic indicator of deprivation. It considers lots of different factors that influence deprivation. So it looks at things like health, education, income, housing, unemployment, crime, geographical accessibility, all sorts of different things to give a nice round idea of what's happening in terms of deprivation. Each region will get a score, and the lower the score, so the more red on this map, the more deprived the area is. And the higher the score, so the more green it is on this map, the more affluent it is. What GIS then allows you to do is overlay some data onto this. So in this slide here, you can see I've overlaid the location of the electrical substations in Dundee City. So we have two different types shown here. We have the primary substations, and they cover various points across the city that connect to homes and businesses. And we also have the grid supply points, and they act as an interface between the transmission and the distribution systems. But in reality, what are we actually talking about here? Here is a wee picture of the Overgate substation, and here is a wee picture of the Dudhope grid supply point. So essentially, it's just these kind of not so exciting pieces of street furniture that you and I have probably passed by lots of times. You can see that the substations are color coded to show the feasibility of applying a new electrical load to the network, such as an EV charging point. So you can see that it's traffic light coded, so the green substations are unconstrained, and as we move towards the red ones, they are constrained. And what we mean by constrained in this context is the extent to which challenges will be faced when we try to add that new connection. So if we want to connect to a red substation, it's very likely that extensive upgrade will be required to facilitate that connection and mitigate the impact of that connection. Whereas if we wanted to connect to a green substation, it's much less likely that such upgrades would be necessary. So I think this really demonstrates the power of GIS. It's enabling you to overlay that electrical data and link it to deprivation, which means that you can consider something like developing charging infrastructure from both a physical standpoint and a socio-economic standpoint. So GIS is really enabling you to visualize that bigger picture, which is really important for something like this, when the factors that influence EV barriers are diverse and have lots of different issues included. It's really important when you're doing this kind of work, though, to make sure the information and data is robust. So I have three key considerations here. The first is the indicator holistic? So often with this kind of work, you're wanting to look at quite niche data that perhaps isn't readily available. And sometimes you'll have to use maybe like a proxy or a substitute indicator. So for example, one of our barriers from earlier was possession of a regular workplace. So that perhaps won't be readily available data. So you could perhaps use unemployment as a substitute, but you have to think, is that holistic? Is that getting exactly what I want? Unemployment would allow you to capture the people who have no workplace. But what about those who are casually employed or those who work from home full time? So it's important to be aware of how holistic and how the extent to which your indicator can capture the bigger picture and work like this. The next point I have here is the indicator standardized? What I mean by that is there a standardized method of data collection? Sometimes what you'll have is different regions acting autonomously when they collect data, so using their own method, and that can sometimes make a comparison between regions problematic. So it's important to bear that in mind. And then the last point I have here is, when was the data recorded? So sometimes work like this can rely on census data, and that is known for sometimes going out of date quite quickly. So again, just something to bear in mind with this kind of work. So just to wrap up, I hope that I've demonstrated that GIS will present opportunities to identify where barriers to EV uptake are in order to widen access to EVs. We've seen that the broader zone analysis can give a rough snapshot of what's going on, but it's likely that finer resolution work which will provide the most value. And I think there are lots of different ways this kind of work can go from here. And I think it will also perhaps pose broader related research questions, such as the role of socioeconomic factors in development of our electrical grid, or how can we incentivize the decarbonisation of transport to all of society. So thank you so much for your time. I really hope it was interesting for you, and I'd love to take any questions or hear any comments.
Yeah, thank you very much, Katie. Very insightful presentation, and I think it's highly relevant in the context of the world we're living in right now, because of course there is this push to drive adoption of electric vehicles, but as you very ably outlined, there are still a number of challenges related to that, and it's of course not just the technology, as you've outlined, it's social demographic challenges as well. I've got one or two questions for you while we're also looking at what's coming through on the chat. The first question I have for you is, in light of the fact that we are, through COVID, seeing changes in travel behaviours, and travel behaviours to a degree shaped by our work behaviours, what role do you think that GIS can play in helping us to identify how those changing travel behaviours, work behaviours, i.e. work from home, might also then have knock-on impacts in terms of demand, access to charge points for electric cars as more people are acquiring electric cars, electric vehicles?
Yeah, no, I think that's like a really good point. And I think, I guess COVID has had a far-reaching impact. And yes, of course, like there will be a lot of people now deciding to stay with the work from home model. So that is going to have an impact on the transport network in general. But I think COVID has also pushed for an increase in preference for individual mobility. So I think people are more likely to now prefer having their own car than relying on public transport. So I think, yes, I suppose transport maybe less common isn't the right phrase, but because people are being less mobile working from home, that will have an impact, of course. But I do think there will be a strong push towards individual mobility, which will only increase the need for the charging infrastructure to be there. And I think GIS will play a big role in that because of its ability to identify what's going on across different regions. I think there's lots of different things and different ways you can bring information into GIS and manipulate it and use it. So yeah, I think GIS will have a really big role, and perhaps there'll be new ways of using GIS as a result of this change in mobility trend.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a great answer, and I think there's, as you say, many challenges and opportunities that are occurring in real time as a consequence of COVID. Also got a question in the chat from Caitlin Cottrell at University of Aberdeen. And Caitlin asks, Katie, will you be looking at any more detailed spatial statistics as part of your research? For example, spatial clustering or dispersion of similar areas / access?
Yes, I would love to do that. I think for me, GIS is like a constantly like evolving thing for me. I feel like every day I find a new thing it can do. So yeah, I think the stuff I did in this presentation was perhaps more broad and looking at more maybe clunky statistics. But I do think moving towards that kind of work would be a really, really good shout in terms of this particular work with trying to plan better charging infrastructure.
Thanks for that. And we've got time for one more question, which I'll throw at you. And this is more in the context of more lower population density areas and locations, rural and island areas. So what do you think some of the opportunities but also challenges are when you're applying GIS to look at how you might be identifying the right locations to increase uptake of EVs in more rural and island locations? Yeah,
I think that's one of the most interesting things about looking at Scotland, like specifically, is just the variations across the different regions. I think, as you'll have seen from the broader zone analysis map, you can see like how big the Highland zone is, for example, and it will be a very diverse zone. So I think it's really important in GIS to be looking at smaller zones, particularly in the rural areas, because they will face a multitude of challenges that somewhere that perhaps Glasgow City wouldn't face. So I think it will be really important to pay close attention to those regions as well, because as I said at the start, it's really important that we all move together towards net zero. Net zero can't be achieved unless everyone can move together. So not only will you have like deprivation issues, you will also have like accessibility and kind of issues that rural communities will face that perhaps urban ones won't. So yeah, it will be a strong focus, I'm sure.
Yeah, good. That's good to know, because you've hit the nail on the head. There has to be a just transition. This has to work for everyone, irrespective of where you happen to live and work. So once again, Katie, thank you for your presentation and answering the questions. Very, again, insightful. We're now going to move on to our second academic presenter, this morning. That's Jorge Eslava Batista. And Jorge, his research is focusing on the impacts of decarbonisation on automotive after sales, which I think is an area that hasn't necessarily been explored in that much detail. So really looking forward to Jorge's presentation. So Jorge, over to you, if you can share your screen.
Okay, hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, yes.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Jorge Slava. I'm a PhD student in the Center for Transport Research at the University of Aberdeen. My research is entitled Investigating the Impacts of Decarbonization on Automotive After-Sales. Here's the context for this presentation. That's 4 sections. First one is research in context, electric vehicles and facts for the after-sales industry. The third one is research design, and I'm going to tell you something about the research findings. To talk about the research context, I can mention from one side that it's known that transport is 95% dependent on fossil fuels. And on the other side, after sales is the supply of services once the good, in this case, a car, is sold. Why after sales is important for the automotive industry? The chart shows 54% of automotive industry profits come via after sales, while new sales cars profits are just 11%. This slide shows the chart on the left, the current portfolio of vehicles nowadays, highlighting that EVs are all those vehicles which main source of propulsion is one or more electric motors and have the possibility to be plugged to an energy outlet, such as electricity or hydrogen. Hydrogen is understood as the environment where the electricity is stored in this case. Under this definition, electric vehicles are battery electric vehicles, BEVs, fuel cell electric vehicles, FCEVs, and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, PHEVs, as you can see in the market. It's important to emphasize that hybrid electric vehicles, HEVs, are not considered electric vehicles because they use internal combustion engines as main source of propulsion, and the batteries are charged by a regenerative brake system. Talking about the research design, this research has a mixed methods approach, but mainly qualitative. It contains 5 objectives to be met in 4 stages with 4 different data collection methods. The aim of the research is to understand the implications of decarbonization upon the automotive after-sales business and the automotive industry. This presentation is focused on the findings of objective 3, stage 3. But first, I'm going to tell you something about the previous stages. The first stage involved a literature review, and the objective is identifying existing policies and context for decarbonization, which will impact on the automotive after sales. And some findings from this stage is that EVs could potentially generate a drop in income, as EVs have fewer working parts, additional units, and longer maintenance intervals. Brakes are used in about 10% of any internal combustion engine car. For example, a Tesla has service intervals each 20,000 kilometers. A Toyota Mirai, which is a fuel cell electric vehicle, have annual maintenance frequency with no change of any part in the manual. On the other side, a current internal combustion engine car goes to the workshop between about 5,000 and 13,000 kilometers for cars in the popular segment, with at least an oil filter to be changed in that intervention. Another finding is that industrial and energetic national interest could drive the new technologies adoption agenda, and policies discouraging use and ownership of cars and supporting adoption of EVs have potential negative impacts on the automotive after sales. Passing to the second stage, that is an online survey that used an online survey of experts The objective is to develop more detailed understanding of after-sales perspective on decarbonization impacts. I found that there is an overall pattern of generalized uncertainty of respondents regarding the future of after-sales business due to increasing EV adoption. And most respondents expect that EVs could foster the entrance of new players and new business models to the after-sales business. Passing to the third stage, the main part of this presentation, it's involve a set of interviews, which objective is to study specific impacts on the after-sales industry, exploring consequences generated from decarbonization policies. I found that investment in technology will be a condition for businesses which want to remain active in the industry, which could mean a consolidation in the industry as a defense mechanism. It's perceived a battleground for client data and card data, but at the same time, new players from technology sectors, such as Google, Amazon, IBM, would be interested on only client data to generate revenues from selling data as a broker. Some examples are provided access to location, speed, and time data, so retailers can target customers in vicinity, identification of parking spots, smarter grid and urban planning data. Data could have interest in other sectors such as insurance, health, public sector, and renewable energy industry. It's perceived that interviewees think that business from technological sector would not be much interested in the car data, such as what kind of brake system any specific client could need depending on the geographic location they live, or if X or Y part need to be replaced soon. It is perceived as well that EVs will open the door to new business players, but it's not clear when and how they could enter. Additional original equipment manufacturers or OEMs have the capacity to create their own entry barriers. Some other findings from this stage is that the generalized opinion from most participants is that the technical customer service is the after-sales business unit that could be positively impacted by EV adoption. Anticipated new business model trends point to a closer relationship with the customer using data generated by the vehicles. It's generally agreed by interviews that remote interventions to vehicles using specialized tools and software will be common. This distance intervention imply consequences on the labor force reduction, achieving the setup of workshops and the reduction in number and high investment in technology rather than facilities. And it is identified that workshops could be smaller given the elimination of waste oil storage. Talking about the spare parts business, the examination posed through the literature review found the stakeholders whose businesses are based on manufacture and trade working on additional units parts will be at risk with the adoption of electric vehicles. Evidence of the interviews shows almost unanimity around these expectations. Furthermore, the overall perception is that the after-sales business unit that will be most negatively affected is spare parts. There are two main strategic responses for the future of spare parts business: standardization of parts, and the other one, specialization of parts, based on evolution of own capabilities to innovate and maintain new players outside their niche of interest. More findings from this stage is digital platforms such as Amazon or eBay could claim a strong portion of the spare parts trade business, but in the segment of generic parts, which is not the interesting portion for the business for the original equipment manufacturers or the core brands, as the captive parts are. Those captive parts are parts that involve a high development of technology and a big portion of innovation. I found as well that incumbent manufacturers are not filling the technology gap that the energy transition is creating in the automotive sector, and consequence of this is the entrance of new players from other sectors. It's understood that OEMs, dealers, do not have substantial incentives to sell EVs instead of internal combustion vehicles, based on the potential negative impact on after sales that EV represent. Current practices associated predominantly with ICE's business models are perceived as outdated, and the fact that new players come from different sectors, even without experience manufacturing vehicles, would disrupt the inner thinking of the industry. Talking about just about the last stage, this fourth stage involves workshops as a collection method using the scenario planning tool. The objective is to develop future scenarios for after-sales business under different strategies and suggest recommendations for new business models in light of decarbonization strategies. This stage is to use the findings from literature review, survey, and interviews to develop potential future scenarios for the automotive market in Europe and Latin America, and to have experts explore how the after-sales market could best position itself to respond. During the workshop, it was found that governance, attitude, and environmental pressure were found as the variables with the highest impact and the highest level of unpredictability on the industry, creating for feasible scenarios. Environmental pressure can develop two strategic responses, one with a technical approach and the other with a societal approach, and governance attitude could decide to support safeguarding driving or select a set of public policy that promote environmental sustainability. This was a summary of my research. I want to thank for your audience, and I hope you have enjoyed this presentation.
Thank you, Jorge. Yes, I mean, I've certainly enjoyed it. I'm sure the other people that are viewing it also have too. And as I said in the introduction, this is an area that hasn't necessarily been explored in so much detail from an academic standpoint or industry standpoint, because so much has been focused on uptake, sale of EVs, and not necessarily this more downstream implications of what that actually means when it comes to after sales. So the immediate question that springs to my mind, Jorge, is really one related to policy, because if, as you're outlining, the actual OEMs, the manufacturers, don't seem particularly inclined to change their business models, their approach, then what opportunity might there be for government policy to ensure that those effects in the after-sales markets aren't too negative, i.e., meaning that the people who are doing those jobs today, in garages, mechanics, and so forth, that there's a role for them in the future? Because if not, the implications from an employment standpoint could be quite negative, quite consequential, couldn't they?
Yes, I think a key point is the retraining of labor force. Nowadays, the technicians, for example, are more mechanical trained, and these new vehicles will need there is a discussion between interviewees, participants of the research, that if the new vehicles need higher skills or it's just a set of different skills. I could say that it's different skills, but the government should develop policy to retrain the labor force in this country and everywhere.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very, very important point. I think we all recognise that retraining, reskilling is going to be needed. And how much of that retraining, reskilling do you think should be focused on exploiting the data? Because you've highlighted in your presentation that one of the opportunities is the amount of data that's going to be generated through electric vehicles, and how that data can be used, I guess, both to improve the performance of the electric vehicles, but also, to create other business models that make money. So is your sense that from a skill and training standpoint, more focus should be placed on developing those more sort of data-focused skills as well as the actual engineering skills?
I think that's one finding that I could say. People from the industry are in the box, maybe. They are not thinking about new, like how this transition could affect, and it's so common. They focus their answers to on retraining of technical skills, and in that technical skills, data skills are not much mentioned. So in that way, it's like the last part of the presentation, I said something that the incumbents are not at the same pace of the transition. This is one of the factors, or one of the challenges that the industry is facing.
Jorge, and we're now going to move on to our ultimate presenter this morning or this afternoon, and that is Jenny Milne from University of Aberdeen. And her focus, it's an area of particular interest to me. It's all things rural, and particularly rural mobility as a service, and how that as a technology and through platforms can potentially improve access and accessibility and affordable access to transport for those who live and work in rural communities. So Jenny, if you're ready to go, hopefully we'll see your screen very shortly. There we go.
Can you hear me, Alex? Because this is all new software.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? And hopefully you can see the presentation, can you?
Yep, sure can. All good.
Fantastic. Well, I'm just going to bring a bit of Christmas to the event, because we haven't done anything Christmassy and we need to feel Christmassy. So I'm Jenny Milne, and as the slide says, I'm based at the University of Aberdeen, and I'm a part-time researcher. My PhD is actually part funded by ETP, and I was the first transport PhD for ETP, which is quite exciting, and it's also part funded by HiTrans. I see some of the audience are probably quite familiar with my name, so apologies if some of this is familiar to you, but the next sort of 10-15 minutes is focusing on the international context of rural mobility as a service and the findings. And the reason for doing that is when I started the PhD now 4 years ago, there were only 6 publications on rural mass, and that's now up to 20. So there really isn't much of an evidence base out there. So when you're looking at the UK and Scotland, we needed to look a bit further afield, and that's why we started to look at international rural mobility. I'm also privileged enough to be part of the International Transport Forum working group on the periphery. So that also gave me a bit more insight into what was happening internationally. So this year I've been interviewing governments, organisations and suppliers about this concept of mobility as a service, which you could describe as being a way of integrating mobility solutions. And if you're not familiar with mobility as a service, please have a Google. You will find 1 trillion different definitions, and there's still not one concise definition, but it's about bringing together different mobility solutions and providing an extra offering and value. So I included a lot of different countries, which I'll come into in a minute. We looked at the barriers and challenges that were within rural mass. I'll also explain to you how stakeholder partnerships and collaborations really came out as a theme within the interviews that I did. And every country has different dynamics and different setups, and in particular, the ways that they've funded and procured mobility systems. And it wasn't just always rural that they were doing. And obviously key to us is the role of decarbonisation. And it's important to say at this point in time, there is very, very little information about decarbonisation and mass. There's a lot of guesswork out there, but there's very little evidence base. So this work that I'm doing will help add to that. We also looked at the role of technology and how data and relevant standards are an issue for many countries, and some are further afield, further on than others. And then importantly for me is what do people in these governments and organisations see for rural areas and technology and transportation and mass, and how ready are people for this to be given to them? So here you go. This is Stephen over in Sweden. I just took a screenshot when I was doing the interview, and it's always nice to put faces. But as you can see there, Japan, Sweden, Scotland, Australia, Finland, New Zealand, yes, even over to America and the Netherlands. Time zones was a bit of a challenge, but these are all the countries where I interviewed governments and organizations. So the findings I'm about to share with you come from these areas and these people. So when we went into this, we knew that there was a big divide between urban and rural areas, particularly when it comes down to business models that we've talked about earlier on and subsidy ratios. So we knew that. We also knew that there was a disparity with how information was spread and what the digital infrastructure was like. We also know that there's been a growth in car ownership, whether you're in a developed country or a more developed country, and also the role of transport poverty, where people can't necessarily afford to have the car to access the service. So these were barriers that we knew, and I've touched on already the funding models and subsidy being a challenge. We've also knew that there was a barrier in the way that we have our lifestyles, and obviously COVID's changed some of this as well, about how we were getting home deliveries and what the pricing of houses were in rural areas. And prior to COVID, rural housing was definitely a lot lower, and we've seen obviously that change. And we've also seen a change in industry in rural areas to more of a service sector and tourism, rather than being the traditional agricultural heavier industries. We've also seen a different type of vehicle, and with previous presentations have touched on the introduction of electric vehicles, and we've seen how that's evolved. Within the countries, we also knew that there was going to be different agendas politically, and that their priorities were going to be different. So these challenges were all there in our head, and we had the evidence there before we started doing the interviews. For me, one big gap was hitchhiking. Hitchhikers provide an insight into mobility gaps, and it was a subject matter that I did discuss with all interviewees. Also came down to data, and we all know this as transport people, that data is critical, and as I've highlighted, very little data when it comes to rural mass. So that was going to be a challenge. And quite often people look at return on investment, and we again touched on those subject matters in the previous presentations, and how much money people are prepared to put into projects and what they're expecting to get out of it. But most importantly for me, my research is based upon that user need and that bottom-up approach. So it's about the user and the community at the bottom going up to government, rather than government necessarily dictating. So these were the barriers that we knew before we started the work. Now, I've included a stakeholder map here on the left-hand side, which, if you can see it, gives an idea of the stakeholders that would need to be involved in a rural mass project, and there's a lot of them. But what the interviews sadly told me was that little stakeholder or user involvement was had in any of those countries while they were putting together rural mass projects or policies or strategies. So it was very much a top-down affair. However, there was collaboration, but mainly with the technology sector and public sector. And that's obvious because they need a piece of technology to be able to implement such a solution. And also public sector quite often was involved with regards to providing transport services or funding, but sadly no communities or organizations. The only country that did was New Zealand, and it was a marketing organisation that came in and undertook work for the New Zealand Transport Authority. Sadly, we can't get access to that information because it's under closed remit, but I have been able to get insights from the government as to what they managed to do. A slightly different stance was in Sweden, this Komiland project, fascinating project, and it's really going places. It covers a particular region of Sweden, and what they have done is introduced a facilitator so that there is somebody in a paid role to work alongside all those stakeholders that you can see in that map, although they have to confess that they don't have a substantial stakeholder map like that, and they would quite like to nick it or borrow it and use it. But that's really interesting because they're the only government that have taken that step. So stakeholder partnership and collaboration are really important, and it was really surprising to find out that this wasn't such a strong theme. Obviously, when they're looking at pilots and projects, money and procurement are key. There was a massive variation in how these projects have been funded. Some countries took the step whereby they 100% funded it with public sector money, others 50%, others in kind, others wanting businesses to put their hand in their pocket and contribute. So a lot of different models into how they've actually procured and funded these projects. The in-kind one is an interesting one. I would say from the evidence I've got so far, that those ones that had the in-kind tend to have the more small businesses involved rather than the larger organisations and multinationals whereby the 50% hard cash came in. The budgets for these pilots for rural maths varied significantly from £2 million. So in Scotland, we had a £2 million pot of money, but that didn't just cover rural, it covered 3 other themes and areas such as urban areas and tourism, all the way up to 50 million in the Netherlands. So there is a great disparity in the amount that's been invested into rural maths. The other disparity was the length of time that these projects were running. In Japan, they don't look at them as pilots. They're there for the eternity. Whereas in other countries, it was 6 months in Finland, etc. Scotland is 12 months. But also the expectations of what was going to get out of this. Again, some countries wanted a return on investment within a year. I go back to Japan again. They didn't have that expectation on return on investment. They wanted it to be a social value and to be able to provide that connectivity. Really important part is evaluation. Many of these projects and organisations hadn't considered evaluation, and if they did it too late, i.e. at the end of projects or when the opportunity had been missed. So as you'll see later on, there's a desperate need for evaluation to be looked at, particularly when we don't have the evidence base at the moment. So I can summarise by saying that in this part, there's been a massive difference in the variation of the processes of how they've gone about pulling together their projects, pilots, or as Japan would say, just part of their infrastructure, and how they've collaborated and brought frameworks together. Decarbonisation, when I spoke to these, and there was 20 different people interviewed, I have to say again that very little evidence about maths in general, never mind rural maths, and how this tool of maths could decarbonise our transport networks. So this information I'm pulling together will help to provide a significant gap in that information. They were really embarrassed by all of this, to be honest, because many of the governments hadn't thought about the role of decarbonisation within maths. It's so siloed. They had the transport departments working on transport projects, and then they had the energy departments working on energy, and the two shan't meet. Now, as we've heard earlier on, transportation's a large polluter. So the conversations have definitely come back to me saying, you've instigated us to go and find out what we can do. But again, we're not evaluating, so we can't see what the difference makes if somebody takes an electric vehicle instead of a diesel-powered vehicle, or takes a bus or walks, by the tool of maths being there. So as I say here, decarbonisation has not underpinned any of the pilots and projects that are out there, and if there is any output, it is pure coincidence. So we are really lacking in this area, and hopefully these interviews, when I produce a paper, will help provide that evidence base and create a bit of a conversation about how this needs to be taken forward. Technology and standards. When you're involved in transportation, technology always comes up. And the two pictures I've got there are TOMP, which is in the Netherlands. They've created their own standards so that all these different operators, whether you're a bus operator, tram operator, parking operator, can all have their technology speak together. And they didn't realize they needed to do this. They admit that at the beginning of their project, but they have now brought this together, and all suppliers are working on that framework. The same can be said about Japan. They're actually on their second revision, about to do their third revision. They realize that this really is an important part of maths. People need to be able to have their technology speak to one another. In urban areas, there's a lot more choice. In rural areas, we don't have as many transportation options. So again, standards became a bit of a touchy subject when we were interviewing. So as I said, it's mainly been a byproduct of their projects and pilots when they've been looking at standards. It's challenging, it's time consuming. Everybody said it was really costly as well. And in some cases, in the Netherlands in particular, and in Sweden and Finland, they have found that some organizations and companies are not willing to meet those standards and are therefore not involved in maths. So that's actually then divided people and become excluded. So I come back to how collaboration and procurement are really important in this, because that needs to be set out at the beginning of this, particularly for any trials and government money. And as I said here, it's often urban technology that's tried to be implemented in rural areas. There's very little rural technology out there. There are a few in Finland, Sweden, and America, whereby it is designed for rural, but quite often it is trying to take an urban piece of technology and implement it into rural areas, and then it ends up being bespoke. So nearly at the end here, because the future is really important when you're speaking to governments. Where do they see things going in the next 5 years, 10 years? And COVID obviously came up as a disruptor, but also as an opportunity, because they saw the fact that collaborations are now happening that previously wouldn't happen. But they hadn't actually thought about whether society was ready for mass. And in rural areas, the barriers we explained earlier on about lack of connectivity, digital challenges, lower incomes, maybe not having access to a digital smartphone, etc. These hadn't really been considered because they'd done the top-down rather than the bottom-up approach. So I asked every single one what they thought about readiness of society in urban areas and in rural areas for the deployment of what they believe mass to be in their country. And there was obviously a significant difference. On a scoring of 1 to 10, you would probably average urban areas over the 20 at about being 8. And in rural areas, they reckoned it was about 4.5 to 5. And actually the Australian government interviewed said it was about 2, because obviously Australia has very significant differences when it comes to rural. As I just say here, rural for Australia is 800 to 900 kilometres trying to get somebody to a dental appointment or to hospital or to school, and again in Lapland, in Finland, different type of rural to what we have here in Scotland. So these had a significant bearing on how they were thinking about their society readiness. Many organisations brought up the integration of services, and particularly the role of autonomous vehicles, and a great deal of uncertainty about the role of drones in rural areas. And again, this divide appeared for rural and urban on these subjects. The Japanese were very enthusiastic about autonomous vehicles because obviously they've got pilots already running, and how that could help rural and be integrated into mass, whereas in other countries such as America, they were less prominent. So I think I could take from this that there needs to be a society readiness toolkit to accompany what we already have as a technology readiness level, so that people can think about how their technology in their countries and their regions is going to fit the people that are actually going to be using it. So to conclude, what are the learnings I've got from this? The school bus, I know it's a bit of a random one to bring at the end, but we all have a school bus in the UK, and you have a set idea of how the school bus runs. But actually in other countries, they don't have a school bus. Netherlands don't have a school bus. And in Sweden, they have a bus which is completely separate from their normal public transport network in rural areas. So actually the role of the school bus is really important when you're looking at rural mass. Mass is still in its infancy, although this has been a chat and I've been involved in it since 2012, 2013. It really still is in its infancy, particularly in rural, because we don't have that evidence base. And as I said, we've not been sharing learnings or practices. We've not been evaluating. There's been a huge opportunity with past projects internationally where they might be really small, but we haven't gathered that evidence. And as I say, it's been very technology-led, private sector-led, rather than looking at climate and the challenges that go with that and decarbonisation. When I start to look at where the rest of the countries are versus Scotland, we're way behind. We're way behind in approach, we're way behind in strategy, we're way behind in investment. And that could also be said for some parts of the rest of the UK. Business operations don't need to rely on subsidy. We have this mantra and head philosophy that in the UK, we always have to have subsidy, while the international evidence shows that many of those business cases and pilots don't rely on subsidy, and they do make money. So I think there's a bit of a mindset change that we need to have here in the UK. And as clearly pointed out, it's all been top down rather than bottom up. So my research is bottom up, so there's very little evidence there. Although it's top down, again, it's small on evidence base. So that's me taking you straight through. And sorry, Stephen Saraceni's face is there again for you, but he's smiling, and he doesn't live in San Francisco, he lives in Sweden. But it's been really insightful learning, and sadly, decarbonisation hasn't featured as a main theme, Alex, for these countries. So hopefully that will change. So I'm hoping somebody will now stop sharing my slides for me because I can't get it to stop.
Yeah, I think the slides have gone, Jenny. So thank you very much for that. And it's a fascinating area that you've got a great passion for and demands attention, not just from a research standpoint, but from a government policy standpoint. Just in recognition of time, because we are rapidly rolling towards 1 p.m. I'm going to park questions for you and move straight to our final presenter today. That's John Lowe from the University of Aberdeen. And John's got a presentation that I think, again, we're all going to find very fascinating, because you think you could probably categorise it as one of those unintended consequences that is emerging from the uptake of EVs, because EVs are heavier vehicles, and that's having impact both on particular emissions and also road maintenance costs as well. So, John, if I can hand over to you, and just to educate us a little bit more on the research you're doing around this very important area.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Alex. Yeah, I'm John Lowe. I'm doing a PhD at the University of Edinburgh. I'm in my last year of this PhD, hopefully. Yeah, looking at particulate emissions and road wear, what's the effect on particulate emissions and road wear from the consequences of zero emissions vehicles. Excuse me a moment so I get to my slide control. So future road transport. In the future scenario, future zero emissions world, we are still going to have to move around. We're still going to have to move our stuff about. And we need technologies to use to operate our vehicles. And the viable technologies just now are battery electric vehicles that everyone's familiar with, hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles, which we heard about earlier from Daniel. And I didn't mention, but perhaps should, is the possibility of hydrogen combustion engine vehicles. That's still very much in its infancy. Other technologies are they're talked about, but not as advanced. Some are mentioned here. All these technologies, however, are only zero emissions in terms of greenhouse gas emissions from the propulsion systems. There are other related emissions, particulate emissions related to transport in brake wear, tyre wear, and road wear, and they all have maintenance costs related to them. And they're all connected in one way or another to the weight of the vehicle. There's some interesting and complicating factors with brake wear and tyre wear. I'm just very briefly telling you about these. With the brake wear, with an electrified vehicle, they recapture the braking energy to store in a battery, and that decreases the wear on the brakes. Similarly, but on the other hand, the extra weight of the vehicle increases the wear on the brakes. That makes it much more difficult to make an assessment at this point. Tyre wear has another factor where large vehicles, when they change gear, the tyre moves slightly on the road, and that contributes a lot to the tyre wear. Electrified vehicles don't have gear changing, or they can, but very rarely, and that eliminates that factor. But again, the wear increases with the weight of the vehicle. I did try to look at these, but I felt I was just making too much guesswork to actually make an analysis of that. So I'm focusing here on road wear and the effects on road wear. And it is to do with vehicle weight. And we know that hydrogen fuel cell vehicles at the moment, on average, are slightly heavier than diesel and petrol ones. Battery electric vehicles are significantly heavier than diesel and petrol vehicles due to the weight of the large battery to carry around. The road wear itself is based on some research that was carried out quite a long time ago in the 50s and 60s. Largely the work done in the US and then developed here in the UK Transport Research Laboratory. Changing this fourth power law developed from the US data, developed a bit more refined, but that becomes difficult to analyze. It depends on things like, as you might expect, a road that's in poor condition is going to deteriorate faster. But roads engineers all around the world use the fourth power, which is going to be fine for my purposes here. What does that mean, this fourth power? It means that the wear on the road is proportional to the increase in the load on the axle to the power of 4. Just to kind of illustrate what that means, if we double the axle load, the road wear increases by 2 to the power of 4, 16 times. So 16 times over road wear if the axle load doubles. To double the road wear, you only need a 19% increase in the axle load. The approach I've taken in analysing what this actually is going to mean, the Transport Research Laboratory use a standard axle of 80 kilonewtons, and the road design is based on the number of standard axle or equivalent standard axles, passing. The effect of that fourth power law is, as we see with these calculations, a small change in the axle load has a marked change in the number of equivalent standard axles that it's responsible for. And we extended this concept to estimate what I've called the fleet standard axle kilometre per year as a road wear factor. It's a slightly arbitrary factor, it produces a large number, and this is how it's calculated. I might take you through just slowly, but you can obviously read what I have here. The number of standard axles per vehicle axle in the class, as are calculated above, multiplied by the number of axles per vehicle, by the number of vehicles in the class, and the average distance driven by the vehicles in the class, creates an overall impact for vehicles in that class. And the class, by that I mean cars is a class of vehicles, or buses and coaches and so on. And we repeat this assessment for internal combustion engine vehicles, battery electric vehicles, fuel cell electric vehicles, and what I've called a like-for-like scenario, which has been kind of talked about a few times, where existing diesel vehicles in the future will be replaced by hydrogen vehicles. Existing petrol vehicles will be replaced by battery vehicles, and it's just a mixed scenario to use for comparison purposes. So I'm jumping quite quickly to the results here. Now, this is actually taking a slight step back from that. This is looking at the individual vehicle potential. So this doesn't actually, at this point, take account of the distance travelled. And we see cars and motorcycles and LGVs, vans basically, are absolutely insignificant in terms of the impact they have. That's whether it's whatever the fuel type. And we see in all cases, come back to these two in a moment, in all cases we see that the significant extra weight of the battery electric vehicle leads to quite a significant increase in the wear potential, which is marked as standard axles per vehicle in this case. Over here, this one and this one, we see that the battery electric vehicle wear decreases, and that's because there's a legislative limit of a maximum permitted load per axle of 100 kilonewtons. And if that's exceeded, then in the calculations would increase the number of axles on that vehicle category, and that produces a significant decrease in road wear. I took a moment to look at what happens if we don't add those extra axles, because that's actually been talked about. There's been murmurings from the UK government that this might be something to consider as a way to relieve the additional costs of creating battery-powered HGVs. This is the graph that we saw on the previous page, and these are the ones which the wear fell because of the extra axle. On this page, they've increased hugely here with the axle, and I've even had to extend the scale to accommodate the additional wear per vehicle, and this is still per vehicle. So overall results, back to the starting point, if you like, where we consider the impact of the number of vehicles in the class and the distance they travel. And again, we're seeing these few categories of HGVs and buses and coaches are responsible for the vast majority, as we see, of the wear here. And in most of these cases, it is significantly more with battery vehicles, with the benefit in this kind of middle range HGV of a decrease due to the extra axle that would be required. So in kind of overall summary, this is a fairly quick look at this I've taken. We kind of aggregate these. We see that in the overall position, if everything became converted to a battery electric vehicle, we'd have about 19% or so increase in road wear, and therefore the knock-on effect would be similar in maintenance costs and in particulate emissions. If everything was a fuel cell vehicle, it'd be a much smaller increase. And the like-for-like scenario that I mentioned earlier is basically the same increase as if everything is fuel cells. And this is because the smallest vehicles, cars, motorcycles and vans, have an absolutely insignificant impact on road wear. So any change in the wear associated with them has virtually no effect. And as we see here, the buses, coaches and HGVs between them are responsible for over 99% of the road wear. And we expect to find a similar increase in road maintenance costs and particulate emissions compared to this overall road wear factor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Again, Very insightful presentation, and one that, as I said in the introduction, might be described as a bit of an unintended consequence of the increase in different forms of electrified transport, all the way from cars to the heavy goods vehicles. I've got a question that's come through from Daniel HVS, and I get the sense that Daniel and yourself, John, might be worth having a conversation between the two of you, because I'm sure there'll be good knowledge exchange to take place. So the question that Daniel's asked, which maybe touches back on something you did address during your presentation, but maybe worthwhile just reflecting and getting your thoughts on it. So do you think legislation and axle numbers or road wear will change in the near future to prioritise zero emission technologies?
That's a bit of a tough one to say with any confidence. I would think probably not in the end, but it's a bit of a guess because it does depend on how the UK government are responsible for that across the UK, how they make their priorities. And I think if they understand the knock-on effect on road wear and tear, and therefore the impact on already stressed road maintenance budgets from local authorities and trunk road operators as well, I think that would be probably seen as a more negative consequence, which they can't readily pass on to the private sector vehicle operators. But that's very much a question of what do we think the government will do.
Yeah, no, it's crystal ball gazing.
Sorry?
It's crystal ball gazing a little bit, yes, in terms of what they might do. I mean, do you also think, because what comes out clearly from the research you're doing is that there are, important differences between battery electric heavier vehicles and fuel cell vehicles. And then also, as you've touched on, you've kind of also included what might happen in the future, where it's kind of hydrogen combustion engines as well. I mean, do you think your research should act as some form of guidance or steer towards where, if it's still possible, where investment should be focused when it comes to the type of technology that's being driven when it comes to replacing the combustion engines on heavier vehicles with something else?
Yes. I mean, there's this, and yeah, I do. And there's this what I've just talked about. There are some other factors as well that come into play. I think particularly in terms of larger vehicles, it's perhaps a bit more clear cut that especially the largest vehicles, I suppose, because you need more of them if you don't exceed the maximum weight limit as well. I think I haven't quite answered your question, actually. Can you kind of come back to tell me the question again, perhaps?
Yeah, no, just to come back round to it, I think it really, the nub of the question, John, was one really focused on investment when it comes to the OEMs, the companies that are actually making decisions around whether to go down the battery electric route or whether to go down the fuel cell route. Obviously, the guys at HVS going down fuel cell, but ultimately, whether the analysis that you're doing around the impact in terms of road wear should be an important factor when it comes to where that investment is focused.
Okay, I mean, it's more of a factor, I think, on the legislation and decisions made in terms of what's going to be supported by the government, or is supported or encouraged by the government. It kind of comes back to what Daniel said well, actually. I would certainly hope this would be taken into account, but it's also only one factor among a number of other factors. And it would be necessary or useful to do a economy-wide analysis of all the factors that are going to be taken into consideration, including things like fuel costs and infrastructure costs. That's actually something else I've looked at in a different time. And as well as the impact on the public infrastructure, like the roads and provision of that. And then there's also the effect on operators and what they have to pay for fuel for vehicles and all of this. So I think that there's a big bit of analysis to be done, drawing all these things together.
Yeah, it does. I think again you've summed it up. Yeah, you quite well. It really is looking at the whole system, and the components within the system and the interrelationships between them. So yeah, I think there's a lot to get our teeth into there. It's an important area. And just recognising we're very close to 1 p.m. now, I would like to extend my thanks again to all 5 presenters today. We've covered quite a diverse area when it comes to transport, decarbonisation of transport. A lot to take in, a lot to learn, hopefully a lot of knowledge shared. and hopefully importantly as well, some new connections made as well, because the conference today isn't just about knowledge exchange, it's about meeting, it's about sharing. And I think with that in mind, as we move into the next hour, which is kind of lunch break, there's also opportunities to network as well. So please take advantage of that if you've got the time, just to maybe have some extended conversations with one or more people that you've made that initial connection with so far this morning. So with that, thanks again for everyone who's tuned in and all our presenters, and enjoy the rest of the conference.